The Theater of Silence. Part 1. The Inheritance of Dust's Influence of Poe and Shirley Jackson. Elias and Sarah had always known that Aunt Ilara's inheritance would not come without a cost. The looming Victorian structure on Blackwood Ridge was more than real estate. It was a mausoleum of repressed family secrets, its ancient floorboards groaning like aging bones beneath the weight of a silence so absolute that Poe might have described it as suffocating. Ilara, the family's eccentric matriarch, had spent her final decades as a dedicating her twilight years to a monomaniacal obsession that most of her relatives preferred to ignore: the arcane art of ventriloquism and the precise, unsettling craft of doll-making. "She could have left us the jewelry," Elias muttered, forcing the rusty key into the heavy, weathered front door. The corroded bronze groaned, a sound that echoed through the dusty foyer like a muffled scream, instantly establishing the oppressive atmosphere Poe masterfully employed. Sarah pulled her coat tighter, the air inside the house colder than the evening exterior. It was a temperature that Shirley Jackson would have associated with repressed domestic anxiety in the memory of cold-hearted inhabitants. Ilara didn't trust a single soul, least of all us, leaving us this house. It's her final, sadistic game. They hadn't come for the house itself, but for its contents. The attic. Rumors had always circulated about a collection. Ilara harbored rare antiques. Perhaps what they didn't anticipate was the nature of her masterpieces. When they finally ascended the creaking stairs to the attic, the weak afternoon light pierced the grimy, cracked windows, revealing a scene that Poe would have found truly macabre. A frozen, silent theater. Hundreds of unblinking glass eyes gleamed in the gloom. China dolls with fixed, lifeless expressions, wooden marionettes with joints like arthritic fingers, rag dolls with painted smiles that offered no comfort. But in the center of the attic, positioned on a small, miniature puppet stage, sat them. A couple. Ventriloquist dummies, crafted from dark, polished wood, seated in miniature, intricate wicker chairs. The male dummy wore a threadbare, faded wool suit, his articulated jaw hanging slightly open in a state of eternal, silent surprise. The female dummy was dressed in a tattered silk dress, its shade now a pale, dying rose, her synthetic blonde hair cascading over shoulders that were fragile, sculpted wood. Their eyes were not glass, but a dark, abyssal stone that Poe would have described as hauntingly reflective, yet absent of light. "Elias, they are grotesque," Sarah whispered, feeling that specific claustrophobic dread that Poe so often utilized. Elias, driven by an ambition that Shelley would have recognized as the very seed of a scientist's self-destruction, approached. "Grotesque, perhaps, Sarah. But look at the craftsmanship. They are museum pieces, likely invaluable." He searched for a tag and found one sewn into the male dummy's coat. "Barnaby" on the female dummy. "Clarissa." When Elias's finger brushed Barnabas Wood, he felt a sharp, impossible sting of cold. A Lovecraftian echo that contact with the ancient and unknowable always leaves a mark. Barnaby tilted, and his articulated jaw clicked shut with a dry, hollow sound that made Sarah jump back, her heart pounding in the quiet. "Elias, please. Don't touch them. We have what we came for. Let's go." "Sarah, don't be ridiculous. They are inanimate objects." Ilara was eccentric, not a witch. They decided to bring Barnaby and Clarissa downstairs, placing them on the mantelpiece above the fireplace for evaluation. It was the first fatal error. Stephen King would have noted that the supernatural doesn't need a formal invitation. It only requires that you bring it into the heart of your home. Part 2. The Dance of Whispers Influence of Stephen King and Shirley Jackson. The first week was marked by a subtle, insidious paranoia. The house seemed quieter than before, but it was a silence that listened. Sarah, naturally sensitive to domestic discord in a way Jackson would have understood, began noticing anomalies. Laughter. Not human laughter, but a dry, shuffling sound, like dead leaves skittering across cold stone, which seemed to emanate from the living room deep in the night. Elias, now obsessively cataloging the attic's contents for an upcoming auction, dismissed it. Rats, Sarah, or the house settling, but rats do not rearrange furniture. One morning, Sarah found Barnaby and Clarissa turned toward each other, their carved wooden hands nearly touching. She was certain she had left them facing forward. Another night, she woke to the sound of something dragging and found Clarissa seated in the velvet armchair in the hallway, while Barnaby remained on the mantelpiece. "Elias, I can't live like this," Sarah said, her voice trembling with the specific type of domestic anxiety. Jackson perfected the fear that the home itself has turned hostile. "I saw Barnabas eye. It tracked me." "Sarah, you're stressed. The house, the isolation, it's taking a toll on your mind." Elias was paler than usual, his obsession with cataloging now consuming him. He spent long hours locked in the living room, talking, or so it seemed, to the figures. King would have grounded this paranoia in reality. The couple was isolating themselves, greed corroding their sanity, the stress of the inheritance opening the fissures where ancient malevolence could plant its seeds. The dummies themselves were not the source of the evil. They were the catalysts that revealed the darkness within the couple themselves. Dreams of an endless, silent theater where she and Elias were mere marionettes, their strings held by Barnaby and Clarissa. In the dream, the dummies' articulated jaws didn't just click, they spoke. They spoke in a language Sarah did not know, a primal, blazed tongue that evoked the cosmic horror of Lovecraft, a language of things before time. Barnaby spoke of forbidden knowledge, of an age before man, when they, the figures of wood, were worshipped as gods. Clarissa spoke of rejection, of the monster Shelley described, the creature who is not created malicious, but is made monstrous by neglect and the failures of its creator. Laura hadn't created them. She had found them in some forgotten, blasphemous ruin, and they had consumed her mind, transforming her monomania into their own prison. In a fit of desperate, Jackson-esque madness, Sarah tried to burn them. In the middle of an afternoon, she hurled Barnaby and Clarissa into the fireplace, but the fire would not touch them. The flames curled around the dummies, as if terrified of their essence. Their dark stone eyes gleamed in the heat, and Sarah heard the dry skittering laughter again. But this time it was loud, echoing not just in the room, but deep within her own skull. "Testu padram parce tres, the theater of madness." Influence of Lovecraft and Mary Shelley. Elias stopped cattle. He spent his day seated in the armchair before the cold hearth, Barnaby in his lap, Clarissa in the chair beside him. He no longer spoke to Sarah. He only listened. Sarah, her own life reduced to the Jacksonian nightmare of being trapped in a house of madness, tried to flee, but the front door would not budge. The windows were sealed shut. The air in the mansion became dense, heavy with the Lovecraftian sense of an inevitable, ancient truth unfolding. The forbidden knowledge Aunt Lara had protected and that Barnaby and Clarissa guarded was being revealed. They were not simply cursed dummies. They were ancient vessels for two entities from beyond, entities that had been banished from their own dimensions and forced to inhabit objects of wood and cloth. They needed hosts. Not strong, vibrant hosts, but minds fragmented by paranoia, isolated and hollowed out by greed. Auntie Laura had not been malleable enough. Elias and Sarah would be ideal. The final revelation occurred on a night of impossible storms. Thunder shook the Blackwood Ridge like the collapse of cosmic structures, and lightning illuminated the living room in flashes of stark, cold light. Sarah, now skeletal, her paranoia complete, entered the room, drawn by the silence. Elias was seated in his chair, Barnaby in his lap, but something was profoundly wrong. Elias's skin was rigid Polito, like polished wood. His eyes had the same abyssal glare as Barnaby, and his articulated jaw hung slightly open in a state of surprise. Sarah screamed, the sound of her own voice alien in her ears, but the sound was abruptly cut short by the sharp click of Barnaby snapping Elias's jaw shut. And then Barnaby spoke not in a language of forgotten gods, but in Elias's voice, a gravelly, emotionless monotone. It was the specific horror of Shelley, the creature who has usurped the creator's very identity. The performance is ready to begin. Sarah, you are just in time for your role. Sarah felt her own limbs grow stiff, her arms heavy as iron. She looked at her hands and saw her skin peel away, revealing a dark, smooth layer of wood beneath. The Shelley-esque horror of transformation, the loss of humanity to become the monster. She looked at Clarissa. The dummy was no longer in the wicker chair. She stood in the center of the room, and her tattered rose-colored silk dress was vibrant and new. Her hair was now smooth blonde silk. Clarissa was no longer laughing with the dry skitter of leaves. She was laughing with Sarah's own voice. We have been so lonely, Sarah. Alara was too resistant, but you are both so beautifully malleable, so fractured. Barnaby, now inhabiting Elias, stood. He walked with stiff, jerky steps, clicking the wooden joints that were once bones. He extended a carved hand to Sarah. Do not fear the cosmic truth, Sarah. This paver is merely the final step of comprehension. The silence. The silence. It is our kingdom. They took her to the attic. Sarah tried to resist, but her mind was already paralyzed by Jackson's paranoia and the Lovecraftian sense of cosmic inevitability. She was no longer Sarah. She was a marionette, her invisible strings manipulated by entities that understood no human empathy. The attic was no longer a silent mausoleum. It was a theater. Barnaby and Clarissa positioned Sarah on the small, miniature stage, seated in her own miniature wicker chair. Barnaby was in his chair, and Clarissa opposite. The hundreds of unblinking glass eyes in the attic were no longer looking at Aunt Ilara. They were fixed on Elias and Sarah, and there they remained, frozen in the twilight gloom of the attic, their dark stone eyes absorbing the light. Barnaby, Elias, and Sarah Clarissa, the ventriloquist dummy couple. Sometimes, in the silence of the night, if you listen very closely, you might hear the dry, skittering laughter, like dead leaves on cold stone. But it is not the sound of amusement. It is the sound of the absolute silence Poe feared, the silence of a packed theater where the curtain never falls, and where the actors have forgotten they were ever human. And so, Barnaby and Clarissa, the true Barnaby and Clarissa wait. They wait for the next dare, for the next domestic breakdown, for the next spark of ambition that Shelley would recognize. The Dreadlore does not end. It merely changes hosts.